Have you ever looked the man who left you to burn in a past life dead in the eye, smiled, and refused to save him from his own grave? I did. When that secondary blast incinerated me over his apprentice's garbage intuition and his blind betrayal, I thought it was the end. But fate dragged me back to the exact crossroads. This time, their pathetic theater ends in blood, tears, and an irreversible sentence. Hello, dear listeners of Zoe Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to cover their living expenses and continue creating more stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or comments below. My name is Emery Peters. I jolted awake in the dead center of my apartment, my spine rigid, my entire body drenched in a thick, clammy sheet of cold sweat. My lungs heaved, desperately sucking in the cool, conditioned air, but the phantom sensation of my flesh being brutally incinerated from my previous life was still violently branded into the deepest recesses of my mind. The blistering heat, the suffocating wave of ash. I pressed my trembling palms against my face, half expecting to feel charred bone and melting skin, but there was only smooth, unblemished flesh. I forced my eyes open and stared at the digital clock resting on the mahogany nightstand beside me. The glowing red letters read exactly 12 hours before the monstrous thermobaric bomb was scheduled to detonate, a weapon aimed squarely at the East Coast Central Power Grid. 12 hours. I was breathing. I was entirely whole. I was not a blackened corpse lying forgotten in the smoking rubble of a catastrophic failure. The memories of my past washed over me with a heavy, suffocating weight. I remembered it all too clearly. Chloe Decker. She was my husband's impossibly arrogant, recklessly confident apprentice. She had stood before that highly complex, critical mechanism and completely ignored standard protocol, choosing instead to rely on her so-called intuition. She confidently reached out and severed the absolute wrong control cable. The fail-safe instantly triggered, initiating a disastrous chain reaction. I cast myself into the heart of the chaos, using everything I had to salvage the situation, giving my all to prevent a total collapse. And what did Arthur Vance, the man I called my husband, do in that crucial, defining moment? He stood back. He wrapped his arms around his precious Chloe, shielding her, completely unbothered and silent as I took the brunt of the devastation just yards away. He abandoned me to the worst possible fate to cover up her pathetic mistake. The blinding light of the blast, the sickening smell of my own burning hair. His cold, detached eyes locked onto mine as the shockwave hit me. Never again, I whispered to the empty room, my voice steady and cold. This time, the blinding, foolish urge to play the heroic martyr was completely dead, burned to ashes along with my past self. Instead of rushing to the scene like a blind, desperate savior, I slowly swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my bare feet pressed against the freezing hardwood floor. The sensation grounding me firmly in this new reality, I walked into the dark kitchen and calmly brewed a strong pot of black coffee. The rich, bitter aroma slowly filled the room, effectively overpowering the phantom stench of smoke and sulfur that lingered in my nostrils. I pulled my secure phone from the counter and accessed the highly encrypted communication device issued by the Vanguard Threat Neutralization Bureau. With a steady, deliberate movement of my thumb, I switched my operative status to absolute isolation mode. No incoming calls, no GPS tracking, complete and utter radio silence. They were entirely on their own. I took my steaming mug of coffee and walked with measured steps into my private home office. I knelt silently in front of the hidden wall safe concealed behind a heavy oak bookshelf. I spun the dial, the heavy steel door clicking open with a satisfying thud. Inside sat neat stacks of classified, highly sensitive dossiers I had been quietly compiling for over 18 months. These were the files detailing Arthur's incredibly shady, illicit personal projects, his hidden offshore accounts, and his quiet, treasonous manipulations. I had always hesitated to expose them, blinded by a pathetic, lingering sense of loyalty to our marriage. Not anymore. I pulled every single physical file out. I booted up my secure desktop terminal and began the meticulous process of backing up every single gigabyte of damning evidence onto an independent, untraceable cloud server, one that I had personally coded and encrypted. Let him try to lie his way out of this data. Throughout that long, dark night, my emergency tactical phone vibrated violently against the hard surface of the wooden desk. The screen lit up over and over again, flashing relentlessly, casting a frantic, strobe-like glow across the pitch-black room. It was the perfect visual representation of the absolute, unfiltered chaos currently unfolding at the bomb site as Chloe undoubtedly began to lose total control of the delicate situation. They were panicking. They desperately needed their reliable fixer. They needed me to swoop in, risk my neck, and clean up her colossal mess. I simply sat there in my leather chair, staring at the flashing screen, taking a slow, savoring sip of my bitter coffee. I stood up, walked gracefully over to the large window, and coldly drew the heavy velvet blackout curtains shut. I climbed back into my bed, pulled the thick covers up to my chin, and sank into the deepest, most profoundly peaceful sleep I had experienced in over 10 years. The next morning, I arrived at the massive glass and steel headquarters of the Vanguard Threat Neutralization Bureau. I was dressed impeccably in a crisp, tailored charcoal suit, my hair perfectly styled, my makeup entirely flawless. I walked through the sliding doors projecting an undeniable aura of radiant vitality and absolute control. It was a stark, almost jarring contrast to the heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside the building. The air was thick with the palpable stench of panic, sweat, and impending death. Junior agents were running frantically down the corridors, shouting desperate orders over each other. A massive, terrified crowd had gathered in the main control room, swarming tightly around the primary surveillance monitors displaying the live feed of the bomb site. Their faces were pale as ghosts, their eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror as the countdown ticked closer to zero. And into this overwhelming sea of absolute chaos, I walked with a serene, terrifying calm. The board was set. The pieces were moving. And this time, I was the one holding all the cards. The main hall of the Vanguard Threat Neutralization Bureau was an absolute madhouse of unfiltered terror. Blaring red strobe lights cut violently through the heavily air-conditioned space, casting jagged, frantic shadows against the pristine white walls. The colossal digital monitor suspended above the central briefing table was no longer showing a stable schematic of the grid. Instead, it flashed a terrifying, blood-red, anti-tamper countdown. 45 minutes and 12 seconds left. That was all the precious time remaining before half the eastern seaboard would be reduced to nothing more than a smoking, radioactive crater. Sirens wailed overhead, a deafening, cyclical scream that gnawed at the nerves of every single seasoned operative in the building. At the epicenter of this swirling vortex of panic sat Chloe Decker. She was crumpled on the polished marble floor near the primary communications console, sobbing with a miserable, throat-tearing intensity. Her usually perfect blonde hair was heavily plastered to her sweat-drenched forehead, and thick, ugly streaks of dark mascara ran down her pale, terrified face. She was completely broken, hyperventilating as she stared blankly at her own trembling hands. The very hands that had just armed the deadliest mechanism on the continent based on a wild, idiotic guess. The exact moment the heavy glass doors hissed open, and I stepped confidently into the room. The chaotic murmur of the crowd died down for a fraction of a second. Chloe's tear-filled eyes locked onto mine. A sudden, venomous spark of pure survival instinct flared in her pathetic gaze. She scrambled clumsily to her feet, her sorrow instantly transforming into a rabid, defensive fury. "You!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking painfully as she pointed a violently shaking finger right at my chest. "Where the hell were you? I called for backup over 20 times. We paged your designated emergency frequency, but you completely ignored us. You deliberately left me down there to die just because you are so incredibly jealous of my position." The sheer audacity of her victimhood was absolutely staggering. She was standing there, having just sentenced millions of innocent people to a fiery grave, and yet she was twisting the narrative to make herself the innocent prey of my supposed petty envy. Before I could even part my lips to offer a cold, calculated rebuttal, a towering figure shoved roughly through the dense crowd of horrified agents. It was Arthur, my husband. His face was twisted in an ugly, flushed sneer of righteous indignation, his eyes blazing with the desperate, pathetic need to protect his precious little prodigy from any accountability. He stormed toward me, his heavy tactical boots echoing sharply against the floor. "You selfish bitch!" Arthur roared. Without a single second of hesitation, he raised his right hand, pulling his arm back to deliver a punishing, open-handed slap across my face. He wanted to physically humiliate me right there in front of the entire division, to assert his dominance and instantly solidify Chloe's fabricated story of my negligence. In my past life, I might have flinched. I might have taken the hit, swallowed the abuse, and quietly marched into the fire to fix their mess. Not today. As his hand swung forward in a violent, heavy arc, my muscle memory kicked in with terrifying, lethal precision. I sidestepped his clumsy, emotionally driven attack, my left hand shooting up like a viper to intercept his thick wrist. I gripped his forearm with bone-crushing force, pivoted my hips, and violently twisted his arm backward while delivering a brutal kick to the back of his right knee. The loud, sickening crack of his overextended shoulder joint echoed sharply over the wailing sirens. Arthur let out a pathetic, breathless yelp of pure agony as his legs buckled completely underneath him. In the blink of an eye, I had him pinned face down on the cold marble floor, my knee pressed unforgivingly into his lower spine, his arm locked in a flawless, agonizing submission hold that threatened to snap his bones if he breathed wrong. "Watch your hands, Arthur," I whispered, my voice dangerously soft, though it carried effortlessly across the sudden, dead silence of the hall. I released him, stepping smoothly over his groaning, writhing form, and walked briskly toward the central briefing table. I reached inside my tailored blazer, pulled out a tightly bound administrative folder, and slammed it down onto the thick glass surface. The loud smack made several senior analysts visibly jump. "Read it," I commanded, my eyes sweeping coldly over the stunned faces of the tactical team. "That is my official duty roster report, complete with the time-stamped digital signature of Commander Arthur Vance himself. I am currently on a mandatory 72-hour medical leave following the severe physical trauma from the Seattle extraction. By strict Bureau protocol, my comms are restricted, and I am legally forbidden from entering active hot zones. I did not abandon anyone." I pointed a manicured finger at the trembling Chloe, then down at Arthur, who was just now struggling to get to his knees, clutching his throbbing, useless shoulder while gasping for air. The person who bypassed safety protocols, blatantly ignored the extreme risk assessment, and unilaterally authorized a grossly unqualified junior apprentice to act as the primary field commander for a Level 5 thermobaric device is the man whimpering on the floor right there, I stated clearly, my words slicing through the suffocating tension in the room like a surgical scalpel. At that exact moment, Director Marcus Sterling pushed his way to the front of the stunned crowd. His face was an ashen, sickly gray, the deep wrinkles around his eyes magnified by sheer terror. The frantic murmurs among the agents shifted instantly. The sympathetic glances that had been cast toward a crying Chloe mere minutes ago vanished entirely, replaced by dark glares of absolute disgust and simmering fury. The entire room finally saw them for what they truly were: two incompetent, dangerous cowards desperately trying to pass the buck for a mass casualty event they had exclusively engineered. "Marie," Director Sterling pleaded, his voice trembling pathetically as he looked from the horrific, ticking countdown on the screen back to me. "I do not care about the damn paperwork right now. You are the absolute only one who understands the complex micro-routing of that specific detonator model. I am begging you on my knees. Suit up and fix this. We have less than 40 minutes before we all burn. I casually smoothed an invisible crease on my tailored jacket, stood perfectly straight, and looked Sterling dead in the eye. No, I replied smoothly. The collective gasp in the room was heavy, thick with disbelief. I am officially off duty. Director, I continued, my tone completely devoid of even a single ounce of human empathy. Arthur made it abundantly clear during yesterday's briefing that he had absolute, unwavering faith in his apprentice's so-called genius intuition. Well, that brilliant intuition just armed a localized apocalypse. Whoever placed their blind faith in that garbage can march right back down into that blast zone and face the absolute consequences of their own spectacular failure. I turned my gaze back down to Arthur. His face had completely drained of all color, his eyes wide, bulging with the sudden, horrifying realization that there was absolutely no safety net left to catch him. Better hurry, Commander, I smiled coldly, a sharp, razor-thin expression that promised no mercy. The clock is ticking. The reality of my absolute refusal settled over the panicked control room like a suffocating, heavy shroud. Arthur realized with terrifying clarity that I was completely unmovable. His golden reputation, his lucrative future, and the freedom of his pathetic little apprentice were rapidly dissolving into dust right before his eyes. The sheer panic in his gaze slowly morphed into something entirely different. It was the feral, desperate look of a trapped rat willing to chew off its own leg to escape a snare. In this specific case, however, he was more than willing to chew off mine. I watched him quietly slip away from the bustling briefing area, his mind visibly racing to construct a maniacal dark backup plan to force the Bureau into a corner. He needed a devastating catalyst to shift the board back into his favor. 20 minutes later, a junior technician approached me with a breathless, urgent message. Director Sterling supposedly needed me down in the sub-basement immediately, specifically inside underground pressure chamber number 4, to physically receive a set of highly classified emergency override codes. The request was highly irregular. It made zero tactical sense to isolate personnel during an active countdown. I knew instantly it was bait. I could smell the distinct stench of Arthur's absolute desperation clinging to the message. But to permanently trap a predator, you have to willingly walk into the jaws of the beast and let it think it has won. I descended alone into the sterile, heavily fortified sub-basement of the facility. The air down here was frigid, thick with the low, rhythmic hum of massive auxiliary generators. The blaring red strobe lights from the upper levels were replaced by harsh, unforgiving fluorescent strips that illuminated the bare concrete walls. Chamber number 4 was an isolated reinforced bunker, separated from the main hallway by heavy, foot-thick solid steel blast doors designed to withstand massive seismic shocks and explosive pressure waves. I paused for a single breath, evaluating the risks, and then I stepped firmly over the thick metal threshold. The exact instant my weight shifted past the heavy door frame, the deafening metallic shriek of the emergency mechanical lockdown system violently pierced the dead silence of the corridor. The colossal steel blast door slammed down from the upper track with the terrifying speed and unstoppable force of an industrial guillotine. My finely tuned combat reflexes flared instantly. I violently jerked my body backward, throwing my entire weight out of the deadly doorway in a desperate bid to escape. But human flesh is no match for synchronized hydraulics. I was a fraction of a second too late. The heavy steel door brutally slammed shut, catching my right arm exactly midway down the forearm. The sound was something straight out of an absolute, visceral nightmare. It was a dry, sickening, deafening crunch. The unmistakable, horrifying sound of dense human bone violently exploding into 100 jagged, irreparable splinters under thousands of pounds of unforgiving pressure. A blinding, white-hot agony tore through my entire nervous system. An electrical shock of pure pain so intense it completely obliterated the air from my lungs and turned my vision into a swirling vortex of violently bright static. I collapsed hard against the heavy steel frame, gasping like a drowning woman, my knees giving out entirely. My right arm from the elbow down was completely pulverized. trapped and utterly crushed beneath the immovable steel barrier. Thick, dark, crimson blood immediately began pooling rapidly across the pristine white floor tiles, soaking completely through the expensive tailored fabric of my charcoal suit. Through the thick, bulletproof observation glass embedded in the adjacent concrete wall, I saw him, Arthur. He was standing safely in the dim corridor, completely untouched, holding a heavy tactical radio tightly to his mouth. His face was entirely devoid of even a single shred of human warmth or husbandly concern. His eyes were dead, cold, and utterly terrifying in their absolute lack of remorse. I watched his lips move rapidly as he pushed the broadcast button, projecting a voice of sheer manufactured hysteria across the primary bureau communication frequency. Medical emergency in the sub-basement. The automated pneumatic system in chamber number 4 just suffered a catastrophic failure. Emery is trapped. She suffered a horrific accident. We need medics down here right now. As soon as he released the broadcast button, his frantic, panicked expression instantly melted away, replaced by a dark, twisted smirk of pure malice. He reached out and pressed the button for the localized internal intercom. His voice filtered into my sealed chamber, dripping with a poisonous, chilling calm that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up despite the blinding pain. "You forced my hand, Emery," he whispered, the sound echoing hollowly off the metal walls. "You left me with absolutely no other choice. You are permanently crippled now. Your dominant right arm is entirely useless. With the primary fixer physically taken out of the equation, the Bureau has absolutely no other options left. Director Sterling will be completely forced to restore full intervention rights to Chloe. After all, she is the only person left alive who intimately knows the structural layout of that bomb, because I trained her myself. You should have just swallowed your pride and done your job like a good, obedient wife." The sheer, overwhelming pain radiating from my injured arm was enough to push anyone to their absolute limit. A sharp, metallic taste filled my mouth as I bit down hard on my lip, fighting with everything I had to keep from passing out. I slowly reached over and wrapped my left hand tightly around my wounded bicep, desperately applying pressure to stem the severe flow. I could feel the warmth spilling over my fingers, heavy and slick. I slowly lifted my head, fighting violently through the thick, suffocating fog of excruciating agony. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I did not beg him to override the system and release the door. Instead, I stared directly into the cold eyes of the man who had just intentionally mutilated me. I let a slow, terrifying half-smile spread across my pale, blood-spattered face. My eyes burned with a ruthless, triumphant fire that pierced right through the thick bulletproof glass, making Arthur physically recoil a step back in sudden, inexplicable dread. The arrogant idiot had completely taken the bait. His vile, unforgivable crime was now perfectly executed, and my final, inescapable trap was irrevocably sprung. The emergency medical team had managed to pry the hydraulic blast door open just enough to drag me out of the sub-basement. Now, I was sitting rigidly on a sterile steel cot in the glass-walled trauma bay adjacent to the main command center. My completely mangled right arm was bound tightly in thick, pressure-activated combat bandages and encased in a heavy titanium splint. The trauma surgeon had just injected a massive, horse-sized dose of synthetic morphine directly into my neck. The icy chemical rush of the painkiller flooded my bloodstream, dulling the excruciating, blinding agony into a deep, throbbing hum. My vision sharpened. Director Sterling burst through the swinging doors of the medical bay. Accompanied by 2 armed tactical paramedics, he looked completely unhinged. "We are securing a medevac chopper for you immediately, Emery," Sterling barked, his voice tight with absolute panic. "You are going straight to the Naval Hospital. You are entirely out of this fight." "Cancel the chopper," I replied flatly, my voice eerily calm as I firmly pushed the medic away with my uninjured left hand. "I am absolutely not leaving this facility. Marcus." Before Sterling could even begin to argue, Arthur shoved his way into the cramped trauma room. He immediately dropped to his knees beside my cot. his face a perfectly constructed mask of absolute, devastated agony. He reached out with trembling hands, hovering over my shattered arm but purposefully not touching it, playing the role of the horrified, grief-stricken husband to absolute perfection. "My God, Emery," Arthur choked out, forcing a fake, desperate sob into his throat. He turned his tear-filled eyes up toward the director. "Marcus, she is completely incapacitated. We are out of time. We have exactly 27 minutes before that bomb vaporizes this entire sector. You have to authorize remote system access for Chloe right now. Let her establish a secure downlink to the detonator core. She can guide the drone defusal from the secondary terminal. I know she made a mistake earlier, but she is our absolute only hope now. Give her the access." Sterling stood frozen, his eyes darting frantically between my heavily bleeding, useless limb and the main digital clock outside the glass walls. The desperate logic of Arthur's plea was sinking its poisonous hooks into the director's panicked mind. Sterling took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat, and he opened his mouth to issue the fatal command that would hand the entire security grid over to the enemy. "Director," I interjected sharply, my voice slicing through the heavy, sterile air like a whip. Using my perfectly functional left hand, I picked up the encrypted tactical tablet resting on the metal tray beside my cot. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard with blinding, practice speed. I bypassed the internal firewall, locked the mainframe, and violently hijacked the primary audio-visual feed of the entire headquarters. "Before you hand over the keys to the kingdom, you should probably look at the main screen," I commanded softly. I slowly stood up from the medical cot, ignoring the violent spin of the room caused by the narcotics. I walked out of the glass enclosure and stepped directly into the center of the command floor. Sterling and Arthur followed me out, entirely confused. On the massive digital monitor suspended above the control room, the terrifying red countdown vanished. It was instantly replaced by a high-definition, crystal-clear security feed from the sub-basement corridor. The timestamp on the bottom corner indicated it had been recorded less than 20 minutes ago. The entire room of panicked analysts and operatives froze, their eyes glued to the giant screen. The footage clearly showed Arthur standing in the dim hallway outside chamber number 4. It showed him actively punching a manual, 5-digit override code into the mechanical keypad. It showed him deliberately watching through the reinforced glass as the heavy steel door slammed down, brutally crushing my arm. And worst of all, the high-definition microphone had captured the audio perfectly. The horrifying sound of my bones snapping echoed loudly over the command center speakers, followed immediately by Arthur's sinister, whispered monologue about forcing the Bureau to give Chloe the access codes. The suffocating silence that crashed down onto the command center was absolute and deafening. You could have heard a single pin drop on the marble floor. The illusion was entirely shattered. The horrific reality of his unimaginable betrayal hung heavily in the air. "He locked her in," a senior tactical officer whispered, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. Almost in perfect unison, the distinct metallic clacks of over 24 safety catches being disengaged echoed sharply across the room. Every single armed federal agent on the command floor had drawn their sidearms, aiming the laser sights directly at Arthur's chest. Arthur stumbled backward, his face draining of blood until it matched the color of the white walls. He raised his hands defensively, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single coherent lie to counter the absolute visual proof of his violent treason. "That is not all," I announced, raising my left hand to tap the tablet screen once more. The video feed vanished, instantly replaced by a dizzying cascade of dense financial spreadsheets, heavily encrypted offshore banking ledgers, and intercepted, classified emails. I had spent 18 agonizing months compiling this data in absolute silence. Now, it was time to burn their entire world to the ground. "Allow me to introduce you to the real Chloe Decker," I stated loudly, projecting my voice across the stunned room. "She is not some brilliant, misunderstood prodigy, according to these decrypted wire transfers routed through the Cayman Islands and 3 separate shell corporations. She is a highly paid money mule for the Crimson Dawn domestic terrorist cell. Over the past 2 years, they have funneled exactly $4,250,000 into her untraceable cryptocurrency wallets. I pointed a steady finger at the terrified blonde woman who was currently being violently pinned to the floor by two massive security guards. Every single time she relied on her precious intuition in the field, she was actually executing highly coordinated sabotage. I continued mercilessly. She intentionally created massive security vulnerabilities, cutting the wrong wires and bypassing firewalls to plant dormant backdoors into our national defense grid. She was never disarming the threats. She was securing their future access. A collective gasp of sheer, unadulterated horror rippled through the gathered crowd. Sterling looked like he was about to physically vomit. And your brilliant, tragic hero of a husband. I turned my icy gaze fully upon Arthur, who was now trembling violently under the red glow of 20 laser sights. He knew absolutely everything. I swiped the tablet screen one final time. A new set of horrifying documents flooded the monitor. Arthur Vance did not recruit Chloe because of her test scores, I revealed, the venom in my voice finally bleeding through the calm facade. He recruited her because she offered him a way out. Arthur is currently sitting on exactly $6,800,000 in illicit gambling debts. He owes money to some of the most violent, unforgiving underground syndicates operating out of Macau. They threatened to skin him alive. So, he struck a deal with Chloe and her radical friends. I stepped closer to him, enjoying the pathetic, broken terror in his eyes. Together, they orchestrated a massive, elaborate shadow campaign. I explained to the paralyzed room. They deliberately staged these fake, high-stakes crises. They allowed the terrorist cells to plant these complex bombs, and then Arthur would step in, demand emergency, unregulated access to the federal disarmament budget to purchase specialized black market equipment to fix the problem. They were systematically embezzling taxpayer money. Over $45 million of federal defense funds have been quietly siphoned off into their joint offshore accounts over the last 3 years. Today's bomb was supposed to be their final, absolute masterpiece, a massive, catastrophic distraction that would completely erase the digital paper trail at the central grid, allowing them to steal another $100 million in the resulting chaos. The raw, visceral outrage that erupted in the room was like a physical shockwave. Agents were shouting furiously. Director Sterling was screaming for heavy tactical cuffs. The sheer scale of the betrayal, the callous disregard for millions of innocent lives just to cover a pathetic gambling debt, was entirely incomprehensible to the men and women who risked their lives daily for this bureau. Arthur fell to his knees, utterly defeated, the heavy weight of his undeniable, absolute ruin crushing him entirely. The flawless, untouchable facade of the brilliant commander and his genius apprentice had been violently ripped away, exposing them as nothing more than cheap, treasonous, murdering cowards. And I had orchestrated their entire downfall with my left hand alone. The absolute triumph of their exposure was violently cut short by a sound that froze the blood in every single vein inside the command center. It was a new alarm, a shrill, dual-toned mechanical shriek that overrode the standard warning sirens. On the massive central monitor, the detailed schematic of the bomb violently glitched. The remaining countdown time, which had been hovering around 20 minutes, suddenly flashed a blinding hostile violet hue. The numbers began to spin out of control before slamming to a hard stop at exactly 15 minutes and 0 seconds. A chilling text prompt began flashing relentlessly across the center of the screen, fatal deadlock override active. "What is happening?" Director Sterling shouted, grabbing the shoulder of his lead technical analyst. The analyst's hands flew across his keyboard, his face entirely drained of color. "Director, we have a catastrophic external breach. The Crimson Dawn hackers must have realized their inside operatives were compromised. They just initiated a remote dead man switch. The bomb has entered full death mode. The core logic board is actively locking out all remote access ports and accelerating the primary ignition sequence. We have exactly 15 minutes before the thermobaric payload vaporizes the entire grid." Sterling spun around, pointing frantically at the senior explosive ordnance disposal tech standing paralyzed near the exit. "Get down there right now. Manually bypass the logic board." The lead tech slowly shook his head, taking a very distinct step backward. "It is a suicide mission, sir. That specific thermobaric core relies on an intricately layered, multi-tier micro-routing system. The fail-safes are rigged to microsensors. If a hand shakes even a fraction of a millimeter while bridging the primary circuits, it will trigger an instantaneous, localized chain reaction. There is absolutely no one on this entire team with the required surgical proficiency to intervene at the microchip level. Touching that core is guaranteed death for everyone in a 10-mile radius." A heavy, suffocating blanket of absolute despair crashed over the room. They were looking at a guaranteed apocalypse. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the violent, throbbing agony radiating from my completely crushed right arm to the very back of my mind. The heavy titanium splint pulled painfully at my shoulder, and the thick pressure bandages were already seeping a dark, terrifying blackish red. "Prep a heavy explosive ordnance disposal suit and a localized micro-soldering kit," I ordered, my voice cutting through the panic with absolute, unwavering authority. "I am going down there to defuse it myself." Arthur, who was still kneeling on the floor with his hands tightly restrained behind his back in heavy steel cuffs, suddenly jerked his head up. His eyes were wide with a frantic, unhinged disbelief. "You are completely out of your mind," Arthur screamed, spit flying from his lips as he thrashed against the heavy grip of the tactical guards. "You are completely right-handed. Emery, your dominant arm is nothing but shattered bone and pulped meat. You cannot even hold a damn pen right now, let alone perform a micro-splicing operation on a live thermobaric core. Doing this is absolute suicide. You are going to kill every single one of us." I walked over to the tactical equipment rack, awkwardly pulling a heavy Kevlar blast vest over my shoulders using only my uninjured side. A medic rushed over to assist me, carefully strapping the protective gear around my mangled right limb. I turned my head and looked down at my pathetic excuse for a husband, my expression colder than absolute zero. "You really never knew me at all, did you, Arthur?" I stated softly, adjusting the heavy protective collar around my neck. "For the past 3 years, I have spent every single night when you were supposedly working late, sitting alone in a sterile room, meticulously training my left hand. I practiced on microscopic watch gears and delicate fiber optic strands until I achieved absolute, flawless microsurgical precision. I built new neural pathways just to become perfectly ambidextrous." I took a step closer, letting him see the dead, hollow emptiness in my eyes. "Why?" "Because I knew you were deeply paranoid. I knew you were fiercely competitive and terrified of my success. I kept my left hand a total secret, a hidden weapon to ensure I always had an absolute advantage if you ever decided to cross me. You crushed my right arm, Arthur, but you left my lethal hand completely intact." I turned my back on his stunned, horrified face and looked directly at the director. "Marcus, I have one absolute condition before I walk into that blast zone," I demanded, pointing a single finger at the 2 traitors on the floor. "Drag them both down to the sub-level observation deck. Handcuff them tightly to the heavy steel railing directly facing the reinforced glass window of the bomb chamber. I want them both on their knees, with a front row seat, to intimately admire what true, unparalleled skill looks like." Sterling did not hesitate for a single second. He violently waved his hand, and the heavy security officers dragged a kicking, screaming Chloe and a catatonic Arthur out of the command center. 5 minutes later, I stepped through the heavy blast doors into the primary containment zone. The massive bomb sat in the center of the room, a terrifying, intricate monolith of dark steel, pulsing with a sinister crimson glow. Through the thick, bulletproof observation window to my immediate left, I could clearly see Arthur and Chloe forced onto their knees, their wrists heavily bound to the steel rail. Chloe was thrashing wildly, weeping with a pathetic, agonizing desperation, while Arthur just stared through the glass with wide, bloodshot eyes, completely paralyzed by the impending reality of his own death. I knelt in front of the exposed core panel. The digital timer on the bomb's faceplate read exactly 8 minutes and 40 seconds. I picked up the delicate micro-soldering iron with my left hand. I held it out in the air for a brief second to test the stability. It was an absolute rock, not a single microscopic tremor, not a single twitch. I leaned into the dense, confusing maze of microscopic wires and highly sensitive pressure triggers. The heat inside the blast suit was immediately suffocating. Worse, the massive dose of synthetic morphine was beginning to wear off rapidly. A brutal, white-hot wave of sheer agony shot up my shattered right arm, sending a violent shock through my entire nervous system. Thick drops of cold sweat immediately poured down my forehead, stinging my eyes fiercely. I blinked the salt away, narrowing my vision until the entire universe shrank down to the size of a single millimeter of exposed copper wire. My eyes were as sharp as finely honed blades. 7 minutes. The automated voice of the command center echoed softly through my earpiece. I began the delicate, agonizing process of isolating the primary logic board. My left hand moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, slipping the heated tip of the soldering tool between wires that were thinner than human hair. I burned away the external fail-safes one by one, bypassing the trap circuits Chloe had so carelessly armed. The air in the room was thick, heavy, completely starved of oxygen. Every breath I took felt like inhaling broken glass, but my left hand never stopped its beautiful, lethal dance. 3 minutes. My badly injured right arm burned with an excruciating, relentless heat. I bit down hard on my lower lip, tasting a sharp metallic tang, as I forced my entire consciousness to remain anchored solely in my left fingertips. 1 minute. Through my peripheral vision, I could see the absolute meltdown happening on the other side of the glass. Chloe had completely given up fighting the restraints. She was slumped against the railing, crying so hysterically she was choking on her own saliva. A dark, shameful stain rapidly spread across the front of her expensive trousers as she completely wet herself in sheer, unfiltered terror. Arthur had squeezed his eyes tightly shut, his head bowed, his lips moving rapidly in a pathetic, desperate prayer to a god he had abandoned years ago. 30 seconds, the voice in my ear warned, the tone now entirely devoid of hope. I reached the absolute center of the logic core. 2 incredibly thin wires, one completely white, one a pale, faded silver. This was the final, fatal crossroad. The exact place where Chloe's supposed intuition had doomed us all in my past life. I did not need intuition. I had absolute, hard-earned knowledge. I picked up the microscopic titanium snips with my left hand. I carefully slid the razor-sharp blades around the pale silver wire. 10 seconds, the voice echoed. 9, 8. I took one final, slow breath, holding the air deep in my burning lungs. 5, 4. At exactly the final 3 seconds, with a steady, unyielding squeeze of my left fingers, I cut the main power circuit. The sharp metallic snip echoed loudly in the silent room. The relentless, terrifying, high-pitched beeping stopped instantly. The dark, ominous crimson glow radiating from the heavy steel monolith flickered once, died out entirely, and was immediately replaced by a soft, steady, beautiful green light that illuminated the entire containment complex. The absolute deafening silence of survival settled over the room. The board was cleared. The game was won. The Supreme Military Tribunal was convened exactly 72 hours after the green safety light illuminated the sub-basement containment zone. The massive, windowless courtroom was built entirely of dark oak and heavy stone, an intimidating fortress designed specifically to crush the spirits of traitors. The trial itself was remarkably swift. There was absolutely no room for any clever legal maneuvers or passionate defense speeches. The evidence I had provided was absolute, irrefutable, and utterly devastating. The high-definition video of my arm being intentionally crushed was played on a massive screen for the panel of 5 high-ranking military judges, followed immediately by a detailed presentation of the decrypted offshore ledgers tracing the millions of stolen taxpayer dollars. Director Marcus Sterling stood rigidly behind the heavy mahogany podium, his face carved from stone as he read the final verdict into the official congressional record. Chloe Decker was brought forward first. She looked entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, perfectly styled prodigy who had strutted through the command center just 3 days prior. She was shivering in a bright orange federal jumpsuit, her eyes vacant and hollow. The judge handed down a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She was to be transported immediately to a subterranean maximum security black site reserved exclusively for high-level domestic terrorists. She did not even cry as the heavy iron cuffs were locked around her wrists. Her spirit was already entirely broken. Then came Arthur. My former husband stood before the tribunal, violently shaking. Director Sterling read his sentence with a voice full of absolute venom. Arthur Vance was permanently stripped of all his military honors, federal titles, and security clearances. He was sentenced to 40 years in absolute solitary confinement for the charges of high treason, embezzlement, and the intentional, malicious infliction of grievous bodily harm upon a federal operative. 40 years locked in a tiny concrete box with absolutely no human contact. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down, the loud crack echoing through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. The tactical guards moved in to shackle Arthur. In that final, definitive moment, his remaining shreds of dignity completely evaporated. His legs gave out. He dropped heavily to his knees, ignoring the heavy steel chains binding his wrists and ankles. He began to crawl pathetically toward the gallery where I was seated, his face twisted in a mask of absolute, wretched despair. "Emery, please," Arthur sobbed, tears and saliva running freely down his chin. "Tell them we are still legally married. Invoke spousal privilege. Tell them I was just stressed. Ask the panel for leniency. We spent 10 years together. I am your husband. Please, Emery, I am begging you. Have some mercy on me." I stood up slowly. My shattered right arm was heavily bound in a thick cast and supported by a dark medical sling. The entire courtroom fell dead silent, watching my every move. I walked down the short flight of wooden stairs, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I stopped directly in front of his groveling, pathetic form. I leaned down smoothly, bringing my lips just inches from his ear. "Mercy," I whispered softly, my voice completely devoid of any warmth. "Did you show me even a single ounce of mercy when I was burning alive? Do you remember exactly what you told me as that secondary blast turned my skin to ash? You looked at me while I screamed and said, 'If you had just supported Chloe, she would have been a hero.'" I pulled back just enough to watch his expression. The violent shift in his eyes was the most deeply satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. The desperate, pathetic begging completely vanished, instantly replaced by a mind-shattering, paralyzing terror. All the blood drained rapidly from his face. His pupils dilated in sheer horror as the impossible truth finally crashed into his brain. He suddenly understood that I possessed memories of a timeline that no longer existed. He realized, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that he was looking into the eyes of a vengeful spirit who had literally crawled out of the burning ashes of hell just to ensure his utter destruction. "You," Arthur gasped, his entire body convulsing. "You are not her. She is a demon. She is a monster." He began to thrash violently, shrieking at the top of his lungs like a completely unhinged lunatic. The tactical guards grabbed him forcefully by the armpits, dragging his kicking, screaming body backward across the marble floor. His wild, terrified wails echoed down the long, empty corridors of the courthouse long after the heavy oak doors were firmly shut. The very next morning, I formally signed the final divorce decree using a perfectly steady left hand. Through a series of incredibly aggressive legal actions, I successfully seized absolutely every single legitimate asset Arthur had ever purchased using his laundered money: the luxurious estate, the vintage car collection, the offshore stock portfolios. They all legally belonged to me now. I wiped his name from the bank accounts and property deeds, sweeping him entirely out of my life like a useless, forgotten speck of dust. because of the permanent, irreparable nerve damage to my right arm. My days as an active field operative were officially over. However, the Vanguard Threat Neutralization Bureau recognized absolute victory and undeniable skill. In a private, highly classified ceremony, I was heavily decorated and officially appointed as the new director of the Strategic Intelligence Division. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window of my expansive new corner office on the very top floor of the headquarters. The glittering, vibrant city skyline stretched out endlessly before me, perfectly safe and entirely oblivious to the catastrophe we had narrowly avoided. I raised a heavy crystal glass of expensive red wine with my flawless left hand. Taking a slow, profoundly satisfying sip, I smiled into the beautiful golden sunset. I had returned from the dead. I had delivered my absolute judgment, and now I welcomed a magnificent new life governed strictly by my own rules. The future, finally and forever, rested entirely in my hand. Thank you so very much, dear listeners, for tuning in to the conclusion of this story. Where in the world are you listening from today? I would love to know. If you enjoyed today's tale and found it thrilling, please consider helping us out with a donation of just $1. You can support us by scanning the PayPal QR code directly on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the description and pinned comments. Your generous support allows our channel to pay our incredible staff, helping them feed their families and continue creating even better stories for you. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.